For nearly a century, the U.S. dollar ruled the world, the backbone of trade, power, and prosperity. But beneath its shining surface, cracks have begun to form. From gold to oil and now to digital currencies, the foundations of American dominance are shifting. This is the story of how the dollar rose to power, how it began to slip away, and what the future of global money might look like after its fall. The story of the dollar's rise to global supremacy begins in the aftermath of World War II, a world ravaged by conflict, desperate for order, and searching for stability. While Europe's cities lay in ruins and Asia struggled to rebuild, the United States emerged as the unrivaled industrial and economic powerhouse. Its factories were thriving, its gold reserves overflowing, and its political influence unmatched. America held not only military strength, but also the keys to the world's financial recovery. In July 1944, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their goal was simple, yet revolutionary: to establish a new international financial system that would prevent the economic chaos that had led to 2 world wars. Out of this historic meeting emerged the Bretton Woods Agreement, a framework that made the U.S. dollar the anchor of global trade. The dollar would be directly convertible to gold at a fixed rate, while all other currencies would peg themselves to the dollar. This arrangement elevated the American currency beyond national borders, transforming it into the world's financial lifeline. For struggling economies, holding dollars meant access to stability, investment, and growth. It became a symbol of trust, power, and post-war recovery. Through the Marshall Plan, the United States injected billions of dollars into Europe's reconstruction, ensuring that the world's economies and their futures were tied to the greenback. But beneath the surface of this newfound order lay a quiet dependence. The world's faith in the dollar created an imbalance that favored American dominance. Nations no longer controlled their monetary destinies. They were tethered to one country's economy and policies. The seeds of the dollar's eventual vulnerability had been planted, hidden within the very system that made it supreme. Bretton Woods and the rise of American financial power. In July 1944, as World War II drew closer to its end, 44 Allied nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to rebuild a world economy devastated by conflict. Their task was to create a financial system strong enough to prevent the chaos that had fueled 2 global wars. What emerged was far more than a recovery plan. It was a blueprint for a new era of international finance, one that would elevate the United States to unprecedented economic power. Inside the conference halls, 2 influential figures shaped the debate: Britain's John Maynard Keynes and America's Harry Dexter White. Keynes sought a balanced system that would protect vulnerable economies, while White pushed for a structure that reflected America's new dominance. The U.S. held the world's largest gold reserves and a booming industrial base, giving it unmatched leverage. Ultimately, White's proposal prevailed, and with it came a system built around American strength. The resulting Bretton Woods Agreement introduced fixed exchange rates, created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and, most importantly, made the U.S. dollar the anchor of global trade. With the dollar convertible to gold and all other currencies pegged to the dollar, the United States became the central pillar of global finance. For war-torn nations desperate for stability, holding dollars meant access to reconstruction funds, investment, and economic recovery. Through efforts like the Marshall Plan, billions of U.S. dollars were injected into Europe and Asia, reinforcing America's financial leadership and weaving the world's economies tightly around the dollar. Though the system brought stability, it also concentrated immense power in American hands. Beneath the surface, Bretton Woods planted the seeds of future tension, a reliance on the U.S. that would one day test the limits of the very system designed to protect global stability. The Nixon shock, when gold lost its grip, By the late 1960s, the Bretton Woods system, once hailed as the foundation of global financial stability, was beginning to show deep cracks. The United States had spent heavily on the Vietnam War and expansive social programs, printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. As inflation rose and confidence weakened, foreign governments began to doubt America's ability to honor its promise of converting dollars into gold at $35 per ounce. Countries like France demanded their gold back, exposing the fragility of the system the U.S. had built. This growing pressure was a direct result of the very design of Bretton Woods. The world depended on the U.S. dollar, yet America could print dollars at will. As more nations exchanged their dollars for gold, the U.S. gold reserves rapidly shrank. By 1971, the situation had become unsustainable. The U.S. was running out of gold, global markets were becoming restless, and the entire international monetary system was on the brink of collapse. Something dramatic had to be done. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation and delivered what would become known as the Nixon shock. In a decisive and unexpected move, he announced the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. With a single declaration, Nixon effectively ended the Bretton Woods system. The dollar was no longer tied to gold. It became a pure fiat currency, backed only by the trust and power of the United States. The world had entered uncharted territory, a financial era where money was no longer grounded in a physical asset. The immediate aftermath was turbulent. Currencies floated, markets panicked, and global leaders scrambled to understand the consequences. But over time, the dollar not only survived, it adapted. The Nixon shock marked the beginning of a new chapter. A world where the dollar's strength came not from gold, but from America's political influence, military presence, and economic dominance. This unexpected shift reshaped global finance and set the stage for the dollar's next evolution and the challenges that would follow. Petrodollars and the global oil monopoly. By the mid-1970s, the global financial system was still reeling from the collapse of the gold standard. Without gold backing the dollar, the U.S. urgently needed a new way to maintain international demand for its currency. That solution came from an unlikely source: the world's growing dependence on oil. As nations industrialized and energy needs exploded, oil became the most critical commodity on Earth. The United States recognized that whoever controlled the currency used to buy oil would hold immense power over the global economy. The turning point came after the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, when OPEC countries imposed an oil embargo that sent prices soaring and economies into crisis. This shock exposed just how vulnerable the world was to disruptions in oil supply. It also revealed a geopolitical opportunity. In 1974, the United States forged a landmark agreement with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter. The deal ensured that Saudi oil would be priced exclusively in U.S. dollars, and in return, the U.S. guaranteed military protection, security cooperation, and advanced weaponry. This agreement quickly expanded across OPEC. Within a few years, every major oil-producing nation adopted the dollar as the sole currency for oil sales. This was the birth of the petrodollar system, a structure that forced every country, from Europe to Asia, to hold large reserves of U.S. dollars in order to power their economies. These dollars flowed back into American banks and government bonds, strengthening the U.S. financial system and giving Washington unprecedented leverage over global markets. The petrodollar restored the dollar's dominance long after gold had been abandoned, but it also tied the global financial system to oil politics and Middle Eastern stability. As the world shifted toward new energy sources and rising economic powers challenged the U.S., this once unstoppable system began facing pressures that would eventually test the limits of American influence. The age of debt and dollar diplomacy. By the 1980s, the United States had discovered a powerful advantage hidden within the global financial system it dominated. Because the world relied on the dollar for trade, savings, and investment, America could borrow money on a scale no other nation could match. This marked the beginning of a new era, one where U.S. influence expanded not through gold or oil alone, but through the ability to issue debt that the rest of the world willingly bought. Treasury bonds became the backbone of global finance, and the U.S. learned that it could fund its ambitions simply by printing and borrowing. As America accumulated debt, its financial instruments became essential to the international economy. Nations invested their dollar holdings in U.S. bonds, believing them to be the safest assets in the world. This steady demand allowed Washington to run huge budget deficits without facing the consequences most countries would endure. The dollar's status as the global reserve currency insulated the U.S. from inflationary pressure and currency collapse, giving it extraordinary room to maneuver. Money flowed in, not out, even as debt soared. This financial privilege evolved into a new kind of diplomacy, one where the United States used access to dollars as leverage. Countries dependent on American-backed loans were encouraged and sometimes pressured to adopt policies that aligned with U.S. interests. Through institutions like the IMF and World Bank, Washington shaped economic reforms across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. For many states struggling with instability, cooperating with U.S. financial structures became a necessity, not a choice. But beneath this era of apparent prosperity lay growing vulnerabilities. As U.S. debt ballooned and global financial systems became increasingly interconnected, cracks began to appear. The world was becoming more dependent on a currency issued by a nation whose borrowing seemed limitless, a structure that worked remarkably well until it didn't. China's challenge, the yuan on the world stage. By the early 2000s, the global economic landscape had begun to shift. China, once seen as a manufacturing hub for cheap labor, was rapidly transforming into a rising superpower with ambitions far beyond exports. As its economy exploded and its influence expanded across Asia, Africa, and Europe, Beijing began to question a fundamental truth of the modern world. Why should global trade depend on an American currency? China understood that true power required more than factories and infrastructure. It required monetary influence. To challenge the dollar, China first strengthened its own currency, the yuan, renminbi. The government gradually opened its financial markets, encouraged international banks to hold yuan reserves, and established currency swap agreements with dozens of nations. These agreements allowed countries to trade directly with China using yuan instead of dollars, reducing their dependence on the U.S. financial system. This strategy became especially significant as China emerged as the world's largest trading nation, giving its partners a practical incentive to shift toward the yuan. Beijing also promoted the yuan through major global institutions. In 2016, the International Monetary Fund added the renminbi to its basket of reserve currencies, a symbolic but important victory for China. At the same time, projects like the Belt and Road Initiative encouraged developing nations to borrow and trade in yuan, deepening China's financial reach. The establishment of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank further signaled Beijing's intention to build a parallel financial order, one less dependent on the U.S.-led system. Yet despite these advances, the yuan still faces major obstacles. China's strict capital controls, political opacity, and limited financial transparency make many nations cautious. Still, the challenge is real. For the first time in decades, the dollar faces a powerful rival with both global influence and long-term ambition, a rival determined to reshape the future of international money. Digital currencies and the decline of trust. By the late 2000s, the world was experiencing a profound shift in its relationship with money. The 2008 financial crisis shattered public confidence in traditional banking systems, exposing corruption, risky lending, and the fragility of institutions that were once considered untouchable. As millions lost their savings, homes, and jobs, a simple truth became undeniable. Trust in government-backed currencies was fading. Into this atmosphere of uncertainty emerged a revolutionary idea: digital money that operated outside the control of any nation or bank. In 2009, the mysterious creator known as Satoshi Nakamoto introduced Bitcoin, a decentralized currency built on blockchain technology. It promised something radical: a financial system where transactions were transparent, unchangeable, and independent of political influence. Early adopters saw Bitcoin not just as a new form of money, but as a direct response to the failures of traditional finance. Over time, thousands of cryptocurrencies emerged, each offering alternatives to the dollar-dominated system and attracting a rapidly growing global community. Governments could no longer ignore the rise of digital currencies. Fearing the loss of control, central banks around the world began developing their own digital versions of money, known as central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. China led the way with its digital yuan, quickly integrating it into everyday transactions and international trade trials. Other nations followed, hoping to modernize their monetary systems and reduce reliance on systems dominated by the US dollar. These digital currencies signaled a major shift, a future where money might no longer need physical form or American backing. Yet the rise of digital currencies also created new tensions. Questions of privacy, surveillance, and economic freedom began to shape global debates. As trust in traditional systems weakened, the financial world entered a period of experimentation and uncertainty. The dollar's dominance was no longer guaranteed, not because of a single rival, but because technology had opened the door to countless new ones: sanctions, wars, and the weaponization of finance. By the early 21st century, the United States discovered that its control over the global financial system offered a new kind of power, one that could be exercised without armies or missiles. Using the dollar as leverage, Washington increasingly relied on economic sanctions to punish adversaries and influence world events. Nations cut off from the U.S. banking system found themselves unable to trade, borrow, or even access their own assets. The dollar became not just a currency, but a strategic weapon capable of crippling economies. This financial pressure intensified during global conflicts. Countries like Iran, Russia, and Venezuela were blocked from international payment networks such as SWIFT, making it nearly impossible for them to conduct business with the outside world. The U.S. could freeze billions in foreign reserves overnight, demonstrating the extraordinary reach of its financial authority. For many nations, these actions were a warning. Dependence on the dollar meant vulnerability to American policy. As sanctions expanded, so did concerns that the U.S. was using its monetary dominance to enforce geopolitical agendas far beyond its borders. In response, targeted nations began seeking ways to escape the dollar's grip. Russia and China developed alternative payment systems, increased trade in local currencies, and built large gold reserves to reduce reliance on U.S.-controlled infrastructure. Middle Eastern and African nations started regional banking networks, while many countries explored digital currencies as a way to bypass the dollar altogether. The more aggressively the U.S. used financial penalties, the more determined its rivals became to create independent economic pathways. As global pushback grew, cracks began appearing in the dollar-centered order. Allies and adversaries alike started questioning whether a single nation should hold such immense control over the world's financial lifelines. What began as a tool of diplomacy gradually became a catalyst for a global shift. Nations uniting not out of friendship, but out of a shared desire to escape the dollar's shadow. The BRICS countermove, building a new economic order, By the 2010s, the global financial landscape was undergoing a profound transformation. Emerging economies like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, collectively known as BRICS, were growing faster than many Western nations and demanding greater influence in global finance. For decades, the U.S. dollar had dominated trade, reserves, and international lending, giving Washington unparalleled leverage. But as these nations expanded their economic and political clout, they began to question why the world's financial system should remain tied to a single currency controlled by one country. The BRICS nations responded strategically. They promoted trade in local currencies, reducing reliance on the dollar in bilateral agreements. In 2014, they launched the new development bank, NDB, designed to fund infrastructure and development projects without the oversight of Western-dominated institutions like the IMF or World Bank. This new bank symbolized a shift toward an alternative financial framework, one that offered emerging economies more autonomy and greater influence in shaping global rules. Energy and commodities became a central focus. Resource-rich nations like Russia and Brazil explored pricing exports in local currencies or in a basket of currencies proposed by BRICS. China played a pivotal role by offering yuan-denominated loans and integrating the digital yuan into cross-border trade. These initiatives not only challenged the dollar's supremacy, but also created practical incentives for other nations to diversify away from U.S. financial systems. While the BRICS framework is still evolving, its rise has already forced global markets to reconsider assumptions about the dollar's dominance. By creating alternative institutions, trade mechanisms, and monetary tools, BRICS is quietly constructing a multipolar financial order. The century-long hegemony of the U.S. dollar is no longer unchallenged, signaling a future where global power may be shared rather than dictated by a single nation. Inflation, deficits, and the erosion of confidence. By the early 2000s, the United States was facing mounting economic challenges that threatened the stability of the dollar. Decades of sustained government spending, coupled with large budget deficits, had fueled rising inflation and growing public debt. While the dollar remained the world's primary reserve currency, cracks were beginning to show. Investors and foreign governments started to question whether the U.S. could maintain the dollar's value indefinitely, especially as economic growth slowed and fiscal imbalances deepened. The financial crisis of 2008 accelerated these concerns, as the government injected trillions of dollars into the banking system to prevent collapse. Confidence in traditional financial institutions eroded. Although these measures stabilized the economy temporarily, they also exposed the vulnerability of the dollar-centered global system. Foreign holders of U.S. debt began to monitor inflation closely, aware that excessive money printing could devalue their reserves. The link between fiscal irresponsibility and global trust became painfully clear. Inflation and deficits also undermined domestic confidence. Americans witnessed the rising cost of living, stagnant wages, and a shrinking sense of economic security. The dollar, once a symbol of stability and power, increasingly felt fragile. Internationally, countries began exploring alternatives to reduce dependence on the greenback, from bilateral trade agreements in local currencies to accumulating gold and other assets as hedges against dollar depreciation. The erosion of trust marked a turning point in the dollar's dominance. While it remained central to global trade, the foundation of its supremacy, faith in America's fiscal discipline, was weakening. As inflationary pressures and debt levels continued to rise, the world began to prepare for a future where the dollar's influence could no longer be taken for granted, opening the door for rivals and alternative financial systems to emerge. What comes next? A world beyond the dollar. As the 21st century unfolds, the era of unquestioned U.S. dollar dominance is gradually coming to an end. Rising economic powers, digital currencies, and alternative financial systems are challenging the greenback's central role in global trade and reserves. The world is moving toward a future where multiple currencies, technologies, and payment networks coexist, reducing reliance on any single nation. This transition is not sudden, but a slow, deliberate shift driven by both necessity and ambition. Technological innovation is accelerating this change. Cryptocurrencies, blockchain networks, and central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, offer alternatives to traditional dollar-based transactions. Nations can now trade, lend, and store value without always depending on the U.S.-dominated financial system. Coupled with strategic partnerships among emerging powers, these tools give countries more autonomy and reduce exposure to U.S. sanctions or economic policies. The digital age is making it increasingly feasible to operate in a multipolar monetary world. Geopolitical shifts are reinforcing these trends. BRICS nations, regional trade agreements, and alternative development banks are creating new pathways for commerce, investment, and finance that do not rely on the dollar. Energy and commodity trades are increasingly priced in local or alternative currencies. Even some traditional dollar-dependent countries are exploring diversification strategies, recognizing that the stability of the global economy may no longer be guaranteed by a single currency. A world beyond the dollar will not happen overnight, nor will it be free of risk or uncertainty. The U.S. dollar will remain influential for years, but its supremacy is being contested. The coming era promises a more balanced, multipolar financial order, one in which power is distributed, resilience is built through diversity, and nations can navigate a complex global economy without being tethered to a single currency. The future of money is plural, dynamic, and uncertain, signaling a historic shift in the rules of global finance.